I'm Scott.
I'm Bill.
And we're the Trade Guys.
You're listening to The Trade Guys, a podcast produced by CSIS where we talk about trade in terms that everyone can understand. I'm H. Andrew Schwartz, and I'm here with Scott Miller and Bill Reinsch, the CSIS Trade Guys. Coming up next on The Trade Guys, we'll talk WTO, the new PIIE study, and finally, we'll talk about space export policy, one of our favorite topics. So, all on the next episode of The Trade Guys. Trade Guys, we are back. It is the week before the holiday season officially begins. We'll be off next week, so this is it. I believe this is the last episode before the new year, so we've got a lot to talk about. Tariff Man is back. We know that. We've been talking about Tariff Man, but now we got to talk about the future of the WTO. President-elect Trump threatened to pull out of the WTO in 2018. Bill, I know that the WTO is near and dear to your heart. Does he actually have the powers to pull out of WTO, or does he need congressional approval?
Well, for the record, I may be the last defender.
Scott, I think he is the last defender.
We'll soon find out.
I think the question of legal authority is one that Trump will probably initiate a debate upon it. I would argue that because our accession into the WTO was done by legislation through Congress passing the Uruguay Round Agreements Act in 1994, it can only be undone by legislation. That said, the provision in the Uruguay Round Agreements Act that addresses this question does not explicitly say the president cannot withdraw without congressional permission. You can infer that from the fact that, A, they passed the law that brought us in, and there's a whole pile of material in the law that requires ongoing consultation between the branches of government and makes clear that Congress expects to have a role in the decision-making process. It also set up, and this is something that I'm glad we're discussing this today because it's something to flag for next year. It also set up a process where every 5 years, the Congress has an opportunity to vote on withdrawing from the WTO. And it would depend on a member of Congress introducing a resolution to do that. And it provides a relatively narrow time frame within which that resolution would have to be introduced. But if it is introduced within the time frame, there would be a vote on it. And that 5 year is coming up in 2025. So there may be a vote on it regardless of what Trump wants to do. Although, of course, if he says, let's withdraw, that would probably influence the vote in a significant way. There's not been a vote every 5 years. There was going to be a vote in 2020. The resolutions were introduced, but the House parliamentarian, as I recall, determined that the resolution was introduced outside the time frame that the statute permitted. And so it was buried. And I think on the Senate side, basically the Senate Finance Committee kept the resolution in committee. So there wasn't a vote in 2020. There were votes on a couple previous occasions, 2005, I believe, and one other occasion, maybe 2000. And it lost overwhelmingly. And there was enormous congressional support to stay in the WTO. It's not clear to me what would happen if it comes up again. Some of the people that introduced or tried to introduce the resolution 5 years ago, Senator Hawley from Missouri among them, are still in the Congress. So they might do that again. So there might be a vote anyway, and that, of course, would address the authority question, because if Congress votes either way, that would be fairly definitive, either that they want to stay in or want to go out. That said, I can see Trump pulling out. The rule in the WTO is you can pull out 6 months after providing written notice. So he might just do that. That would leave it up to Congress to say, no, you can't do that, and do something about it. I'm inclined to be in the group of people that thinks that he probably will do that. And I'm very sad about that. He didn't his first time around. I think he didn't because Ambassador Lighthizer told him it was a useful tool. And as long as it was a useful tool, there was no point in dropping out. I'm not sure that Lighthizer would still think that today, since we've lost several WTO panel decisions on Trump initiatives, from the China tariffs and the steel aluminum tariffs. So today's verdict might be different. I don't think this is something that Trump will do the first day. It's more likely to be something where he will take some action that will violate the rules. There will be another panel report. we will lose because we would be violating the rules. And then his response will be, well, I'm done. I'll just pull out. And of course, that would be, I think, economically devastating. He would defend it on the grounds that, well, then we can do whatever we want to other countries, which is true. But it also ignores the fact that it means other countries can do whatever they want to us. That would be significant, I think. What I think was telling was when this came up in 2020, the Heritage Foundation, of all people, published a report saying withdrawal was a bad idea and that it would, if we left, disrupt supply chains, potentially cost billions of dollars. It concluded the WTO membership has contributed to a nearly 1.5% increase in U.S. welfare, and that global withdrawal from the WTO would cost $2.7 trillion worldwide. Our withdrawal would probably blow up the organization. And it would put the United States in the position of either having no obligations with respect to anybody and them not having anybody with respect to us, or we would have to go around and do what the British are doing post-Brexit, which is to renegotiate bilateral agreements with every country in the world that would establish the nature of our trade relationship. Not a fun prospect, I don't think. So on the whole, mistake, economic mistake. I was at a meeting this morning where this came up, and the business community, I think, realizes it would be a mistake. We did a study in 2019, as I recall, of what would happen if the U.S. withdrew. And what struck me about that is we were asked to do that by a private company. And I spent some time thinking about why would a U.S. company really care about this? And the answer in that case was illustrative. It was that this is a company that makes things that are covered by the WTO Information Technology Agreement, which provides for zero tariffs in infotech products. So computers, all kinds of chips, anything to do with information technology. Well, not anything, but a very long list. And the company was worried that if we withdrew from the WTO, we would also withdraw from that agreement, which is true, and that would affect their products, which would also be true. So I think business is realizing that withdrawal has practical consequences for them. So if this becomes a thing, you can expect it to be hotly debated.
Scott, you want to jump in on this? There have been discussions about withdrawing the WTO before. Why did they fail? And what are the economic consequences of possible withdrawal?
Three things. First, I'm old enough to have worked on the first advocacy campaign to keep the U.S. in the WTO back in the year 2000. In November 1999 was the third ministerial conference of the WTO held in Seattle, Washington. And before the CS gas had cleared from the streets of Seattle, the groups who brought you the turmoil there were starting to talk about how fun it would be to get the Congress to drop out of the WTO in this vote that was upcoming in the spring of 2000. So I was part of the business community that worked to keep the U.S. in the WTO. It turned out the effort fizzled, and there were a few sort of crank members who voted for withdrawal. But by and large, the Congress affirmed the U.S. membership in the WTO. So sort of a tempest in a teapot. Now, economically, it would be quite a setback. And that's one of the reasons that I differ with Bill on the likelihood of it happening. There are really two reasons that I don't think it's going to happen this time around. First is that President-elect Trump has picked a Treasury Secretary who's very close to the bond markets. And the bond markets would have a lot to say about WTO withdrawal. Peterson Institute has done the econometric modeling, but it would be a real setback for the U.S. economy, something that it's a risk you don't need to take, and so it would be foolish to take. So I actually think that he will receive counsel from his economic team that this is a particularly bad idea, given everything else the president has on the economic agenda. But more importantly, the second reason I think it's not going to happen is this is a different world from a foreign policy standpoint than 2016. We have serious problems, all right? Syria is just added to the complexity and difficulty of the tensions and the shooting wars in the Middle East. And what happens there is anybody's guess, but there's a process that has to take place. The U.S. will be involved. Our leadership will matter. The same goes for Ukraine, which President-elect Trump has made a lot of promises about dealing with quickly. I think it needs to be dealt with quickly, but it begs the question of European security arrangements that aren't spelled NATO. And so those are both big projects, not to mention everything that's going on in the Asia Pacific or any other place in the world. There's a foreign policy project list everywhere that I see that's different in many ways than 2016. And what's happened that's different since 2016 is both the Trump administration, followed by the Biden administration, did their best to neutralize the WTO. WTO had long been one of the more effective international organizations. And now it just doesn't do much of anything. We've managed to get the dispute settlement understanding so that it doesn't make any decisions, as Bill would call it. You appeal a lost case into the void and nothing happens. But in terms of advancing a negotiating agenda, the members spend all their time bickering instead of negotiating. So what you have is, thanks to the work of Trump 1.0 and the Biden administration, who had essentially the same agenda on a practical level, the WTO is a parking lot. When somebody's grumpy about an issue or something you did in the trade space, they go and they can let off some steam in Geneva about it. But it doesn't really do anything. And I think the president-elect is likely to just not let it do anything for the next 4 years. Take one of his friends who is a big fundraiser who likes to ski, make him or her the ambassador to the WTO. It's a nice house in Geneva. It's got a decent entertainment budget. There are lots of interesting things to do. And all you have to do is just be able to say no to every foreign delegation that comes into your office. That, for me, is what speaks to the economy of effort required when the foreign policy agenda elsewhere is as difficult as it is. So sorry to be cynical, but I usually leave that to Bill, but not this time.
You're allowed.
That's sort of saying we should behave like the Indians.
Well, yeah, sure, it works for them.
Which is depressing. I would not sell the existing organization so short. It was designed to do three things. One was dispute resolution, and we've talked about that. One was to negotiate, and Scott's right, it's not produced much on that front. But the third is it has a really robust committee network of sharing information and meeting to discuss common problems. And over the years, the committee network that they've established has been able to solve problems before they get to the dispute resolution stage. And of course, that doesn't show up in the statistics. But it's been a fairly robust process, and the United States has been a participant throughout. But I agree with him when it comes to laying blame. Actually, the dispute settlement process started in the Obama administration. And it started, we'll descend here into the weeds for just a minute. It started with objections to some appellate body decisions, two of them in particular, although one case involved multiple examples, more than 20 cases. And this is the issue called zeroing, which is a term that relates to how you compute dumping margins in anti-dumping cases. And to me, the analogy is if you think about gymnastics scoring in the Olympics. In gymnastics Olympics, there are a bunch of judges, and they give you up to 10 points for your routine. And then what they do at the end is they subtract the high score and the low score and do an average of the difference. And that kind of makes sense because that way you eliminate the extremes. What zeroing meant was the Commerce Department basically would subtract the low score, but not the high score, which is uneven, if you will. They would remove from their determination of the average amount of duties cases where there was zero dumping, which would have lowered the average amount of the duty, would have lowered the tariff. And they excluded those, which the result was higher duties. And of course, the foreigners objected to that. And the appellate body fairly consistently ruled against the United States on that. And I can sort of understand it. On the other hand, the United States point of view was also correct, which is there was no rule in the WTO against this. There's nothing in the Uruguay Round Agreement that says you can't count that way. And they thought it was perfectly, and still do think it's perfectly permissible to do it that way. The other issue was the so-called public body issue. And this continues to lurk out there. And this relates to subsidies. When you think about subsidies, there's two issues. One, is there a subsidy? Like, is there a payment? The other issue, which gets less attention, is who's making the payment? Because under the rules, the payment needs to be made by a government body. So, if the government treasury gives you money to export steel, for example, that's pretty clearly a subsidy. The question came up of what happens if the entity exporting the steel is not the government, but a state-owned enterprise? So is a state-owned enterprise a public body? Is it part of the government or is it not? The United States took the position that it is because it's state-owned. That's the definition. The WTO appellate body took the position that it is not necessarily part of the government, that you actually have a duty to do a further investigation to see who's actually making the decision. What that means is it's harder for the United States to prove that China is subsidizing its SOEs. And we've taken strong exception to that. So it's very easy to be sympathetic to the United States position on this stuff. And that's, as I said, Obama started it. The other two continued it. There's a pernicious element to this, too. And that is that what bleeds into this is an argument that has been increasingly coming from the right in our political system, which is the sovereignty argument. And that is we, the United States, should not agree to things that tie our hands, that prevent us from doing whatever it is we want to do. And this will be a Trump argument. And to me, the best illustration of the stupidity of this argument was when 34 senators, and I think, ironically, Senator Portman, former USTR, was, I think, number 34 or number 33, announced that they would vote against the UN Convention on the Rights of the Disabled, which is about as close to motherhood and apple pie as you can get. And the reason was the belief that somehow, someday, for some reason, the United States is going to want to do something. We can't predict what it is, but we're going to want to do something, and that treaty won't let us do it. Which, if you think about it, that's an argument against all treaties and all multinational agreements. But there seems to be this strain of thinking in the Congress and in conservative administrations that should be our policy. We should not agree to anything that limits our ability to do whatever we want. That blows up, basically the entire multilateral system that is based on agreements in which all parties surrender some element of sovereignty in order to achieve a common good. And I get very frustrated at that. But that's the direction we're going in. And the Biden administration made that worse, not better. Scott's right.
Okay. Oh, Scott's right.
About that.
About that.
Not about everything, but about that.
I wasn't expecting that. But anyway, we'll extract that 1 or 2 seconds of audio recording. I'll have uses for that in the future.
Oh, boy. We're going to have that on a loop, Scott.
That's right.
Every time I tell my wife she's right about something, she says, "What did you say? Say that again 3 or 4 times."
Key to a happy marriage. Right?
Bill, my wife is always right about everything.
Yeah, I have the same situation.
But I mean, she's actually really right about everything. So it works out really well.
It makes life much simpler to know that you're always wrong.
You got it. Let's talk about the new Peterson Institute of International Economics, PIIE, study and data set on U.S.-China. Shout out to my buddy Stephen R. Weissman, the great journalist and communications professional over at PIIE, getting this out. Trey, guys, what's the buzz regarding PIIE's latest data set and report, and what is this trying to actually measure?
Well, I have to confess, it's a tad painful to plug somebody else's product.
It's a good one, though, so we do that.
Well, it is, and it is also made better by the fact that they quote one of our products, which was a study that Greg Allen and Emily Benson and I did on improving export control enforcement through use of artificial intelligence technology. So they plug us, we plug them. It's an important database. I wouldn't say it's analytically groundbreaking, but it provides an awful lot of very useful information for future research and analysis. Basically, what they did is they looked at 4 of, I think, at least 6 U.S. lists of bad guys that the U.S. maintains for sanctions purposes. And so if you're on the list, and it depends on which list, but if you're on the list, various bad things happen to you. And the 4 lists they looked at were the so-called entity list, which BIS at Commerce monitors, which restricts exports or tech transfers or data to organizations that are deemed to threaten U.S. national security or U.S. foreign policy, or now under the Biden administration, human rights interests. They also looked at the military end user list, which is maintained, I believe, by the Defense Department, which restricts exports of certain categories of goods to buyers that are suspected to buy them for military end use by China, Russia, or Venezuela. And then they looked at the biggest one, which is called the SDN, Specially Designated Nationals and Blocked Persons List, which is administered by the Office of Foreign Assets Control of the Treasury Department, which is a ban on all forms of commerce. This is the strictest one, a ban on all forms of commerce with listed entities. And these include financial sanctions, freezing of assets to named entities, or any entities that deals with the banned entity. I think this is the oldest list, and it's by far the biggest list of sort of bad guys. Going back to Libya and various sanctions on other Arab countries, there's an enormous number of people named Mohammed on the list. All of whom changed their names once they got on the list. So there's a constant effort to keep up with that, which actually was what the paper that the study cites was about, how to enable the government to catch up faster with name changes, which is the big issue here. The fourth one was the hardest name, the non-SDN Military Industrial Complex List, which is a ban on U.S. investment in firms that operate in or are exposed to defense or surveillance activities in China. And what they've done is compile a database which has some interesting features. It shows that each successive president, and they went back to Clinton, each successive president has put more and more people on these lists. Biden has put by far the most entities, I shouldn't say people, because it's people and companies. Biden by far has put the most on the list, but that was largely because of Ukraine and largely because of additions relating to people that are not supporting, undermining sanctions on Russia or are participating in invading the Russia sanctions. The numbers added to the list that are specifically related to China sanctions for Biden and Trump are, according to the study, actually exactly the same, 384. Now, Biden might exceed that record by a late addition. But, that's a lot of people, a lot of entities. And they also break it down by sector to see where the targets are. By far the largest number are people and entities in the electronic sector, followed by military and defense industries, aviation, space, aerospace, and then followed by other high-tech and emerging technology categories. Then it goes on down from there. So it's a wonderful compendium of what's going on that also makes the point that I think we've made on the podcast before, which is that specific sanctions, i.e., targeted to an entity, person, company, are becoming a much more common thing than used to be. And it was the George W. Bush administration that really started this particular ball rolling by realizing that a narrow targeting could be much more effective in identifying the bad guys that you want to target, sort of scalpel rather than sledgehammer. But if you're going to do that, you end up doing it to a lot of people. And that's what's been happening. It's been getting bigger and bigger and bigger, which then raises the question of how effective these things are. In the end, the recommendations, and I'll close with this, are relatively modest. They are three, which are develop an explicit framework for looking at the costs and benefits of new export controls. Hard to disagree with that. Recognize the market implications of export controls that are used to further non-market objectives. Hard to argue with that, at least from my point of view. And we've talked in the past about the dangers of, kneecapping your own industries in the interest of national security. And finally, the one that's a little bit more controversial is maintain all these separate lists as independent things. There's a movement in Congress to consolidate them. It said, this is too complicated. It's too confusing. These names are too complicated. Let's just have one list of bad guys. Not that we'll call it the bad guys list. We'll call it something a little more sophisticated than that. But the reality is the lists are designed to serve different purposes. And people are on the list for different reasons. And the consequences are different. And I think it would be a mistake to combine them all into one. If Congress did that, it would probably be with the most serious and far-reaching consequences for all of them, which would probably be overkill in a number of these cases.
It's the bane of the existence of many people in the international government affairs business because you trip over these things all the time. It used to happen seldom And it was often a little bit amusing. I remember having a new head of the company for Latin America and trying to schedule some meetings. And this got a request from the State Department. And I had to basically send an affidavit that said, yes, he's Jorge Uribe, and he was born in Medellin, Colombia, but he's not the Jorge Uribe you're looking for, which, if you remember Colombia in the 80s, is amusing. We use these tools so extensively. There's 17,000 entities from individuals to nation states that are subject to U.S. sanctions of one form or another. It's very difficult to first navigate through that if you're trying to just do legal, honest business in any of these firms, any of these countries, with firms that are in the space. It's also easy to trip over and get into real trouble if you're not careful. But also, how many of these are actually working? Now that we have so many of them, I don't know if we could honestly say. So I'm glad the Peterson Institute did this. It's a great baseline. It's a good starting point, and probably is better than having an agency to manage the agencies at this point. But this is an area of growth for trade tensions, and we're going to have to deal with that at some point. Probably we'll kick the can.
Guys, we got time for one last thing. And Scott, this is one of our favorite things: space export controls. We love talking about space.
Yes. And first of all, I think this is a good news story. And I'm going to talk about export controls despite my deference to Bill and his deep knowledge on the subject, because I'm going to talk about it because it's a deregulation story. And it is how do you unleash the American innovation and American private sector and get a real space program again. So I'm frankly excited by this. It is something where there are many different government agencies involved in this. There are different experts at different agencies. One of the things about having experts is you need them, but they're not expert at everything. They're expert at usually one thing. I always think back to Aesop's fables and the hedgehog and the fox. The hedgehog only knew one thing. The fox knew a little bit about a lot of things. And experts are hedgehogs by definition. And they often have such deep expertise, they don't go broad at all. So you have experts with different views from different agencies. What the government is trying to do now for the second time this century is to clear this out and clear out the underbrush and to simplify and make it easier to figure out how to work with partners and advance ideas. I think this is great news. Now, I will tell you that if you leave these regulators to themselves and let them operate as their expertise would guide it, that's how you get to 17-year permitting processes. So regulation does bog things down. But this is one where the objective of the regulatory effort is to clean things up, and I appreciate that. Now, I will tell you, it's the Biden administration doing it. They've been haranguing for the increase in regulation. But much like the Obama administration didn't get much credit for deregulation, one of the things that they deserve credit for was in 2014, they did the first deregulation of space. And that's why space exists now. So full marks to them, much like the Carter administration got no credit for deregulating trucking and air travel. The Reagan guys took all the benefits, but it was actually Carter who did it. In this case, the Obama administration started it in 2014. The Biden administration is deregulating now. And I think that is the one thing that will unleash the American edge in space and high technology. We're still far and away the most innovative economy on the planet. And let our innovators turn loose and work together and build great products like SpaceX and others. So I'm quite excited about this. I think it's a good news story.
I got a question, Bill. What can we expect from the new administration on space policy?
Well, I hope they'll keep this stuff intact because I think Scott's correct. There's a tendency, bipartisan. Every incoming administration comes in with the assumption that everything its predecessor did was a mistake. And the best thing they can do is unravel it as quickly as possible. I mean, Trump intends to do that on a lot of things. But to be fair, Biden did that on a lot of things, too. Trump did that on a lot of things for Obama. Obama did that for a lot of things for Bush. It's endemic. And it's too bad because it too often ends up throwing at least some of the babies out with the bathwater. I hope that won't happen in this case. It does, however, have a fraught history. And I won't bore everybody with the history. But one of the lingering questions here, particularly with space technology, is peaceful uses versus weaponization. And, we have thousands of satellites up there orbiting. Most of them are facilitating communications and enabling us to, make calls to London and make calls all over the world. And some of them are weather satellites that enable us to figure out where the next hurricane is coming from and help us figure out when it's going to arrive. All good things. But there's also the possibility that satellites could be turned into weapons. And we don't want that for a lot of reasons that I assume are obvious. And that has led to an ongoing tension within the United States government over control of these things. How do you make sure that what is going up is for civilian use and peaceful use and not for weapons use? And that's produced a long back and forth for years between the State Department, which controls weapons, and the Commerce Department, which controls dual use items. Of the three rules that they're promulgating in this category right now, the proposed one would move more things over from state to commerce, which means a recognition that there's a lot of things out there that we used to think of as only military that in fact have civilian, peaceful applications. So it's all good, but it has a fraught history. And there are sensitivities out there because I think we don't want to end up in a situation where other countries are able to basically arm satellites in ways that might damage our security in the future.
Guys, as always, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, Happy New Year. We will be back first week of the new year. Great to talk with y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you. All the best for the holidays.
To our listeners, if you have a question for the Trade Guys, write us at tradeguys@csis.org. That's tradeguys@csis.org. We'll read some of your emails and have the Trade Guys react to it. You've been listening to The Trade Guys, a CSIS podcast.